Hello everybody, welcome back. Somebody on my channel, BoggHogster, I think it was. I don't know who that is. Sounds like a very interesting person. I think Boss Hog wasn't that from the Dukes of Hazzard? Anyway, he suggested that I should do a video on the top 10 Soviet players ever. So here we go, because I've been doing a lot of Elk and Ruby reviews recently. They always talk about, in their books, they publish books on really Soviet players. So another website, I think there's a Soviet blog run by a Scottish guy, Douglas Murray or something like that, right? Anyway, here's the top 10 Soviet players. However, one thing I should stress, it's very difficult to get the definition of Soviet players, because you know who's the greatest Soviet player. Because bear in mind that people like Ivanchuk, Salov, you know, towards the end of the period where, you know, Russia was part of the Soviet Union, they played Ukraine. It's obviously Vasily Ivanchuk was Ukrainian, or is Ukrainian. They also played in USSR championships, so therefore they qualify as Soviet Union players. By the way, I think this video would be better if I could put in clips. This is why I need to get my technical skills better. If I could put in video clips or like a voiceover of these players, like pictures of them. I don't really know how to do this. This is why I need to improve my technical skills. If there's anyone out there who wants to collaborate, let me know. Are you out there, Superman? Are you out there? Help us. Help us, Superman. We need you. Anyway, so number one, I'm going to put Garry Kasparov, who's needs no introduction, one of the greatest players in history. I believe he won one of the last Soviet championships in 1988. Might have even been the final one. I think there might have been one in 1989 as well. So Garry Kasparov is number one. Now Garry Kasparov was born in Baku, which is in Azerbaijan, but at that point it was part of the Soviet Union. He later represented Russia. So I believe he moved to Moscow, obviously before the problems with Putin began. And phenomenal calculator, very hard worker, was able to beat national teams in simultaneous displays, which was unheard of before he started doing it. I mean, Garry, you know, is greatly respected by all of the top players in the game. I think Mikhail Botvinnik actually, you know, I read something, I think it might have been by Sezonko or something, and he was talking about how Mikhail Botvinnik was first, you know, presented with this young Garry Kasparov as a potential student. And Garry was reading off these kind of variations. And even Mikhail Botvinnik, you know, greatly experienced player, could not believe it, you know, how many variations he was seeing. And Garry Kasparov has, you know, very reasonable credentials to be considered the greatest player of all time. Possibly he's been exceeded recently by Magnus Carlsen. But him and Karpov, who's my number two, by the way. Karpov, my number two. Garry Kasparov and Anatoly Karpov really raised the bar. The level of play in the Karpov-Kasparov matches was so high that it really raised the bar of professional chess, in my opinion. And that kind of ushered in this period, sort of during the 1980s and 1990s, where all these players came into the game. 1990s, you had people like Vishy Anand, Vladimir Kramnik, you know, Alexei Shirov, Veselin Topalov, Michael Adams, Judith Polgar, Yevgeny Beriev, Valery Salov, and of course many of these players, Boris Gelfand, Vasily Ivanchuk, Yeroen Piquet, many of these players were inspired by these Karpov-Kasparov matches. You know, Anand, of course, is possibly, you know, the most famous of those players, who emerged during the 1990s, was possibly inspired even by a match that took place before that between Karpov and Korchnoi. So Korchnoi was Karpov's great rival in the 1970s. And he actually got the World Championship in 1975 because Fischer declined to defend his title. It was one of the great tragedies of the chess. Can you imagine if Fischer and Kasparov and Karpov had played all these matches in the 1970s, 1980s, throw Korchnoi into the mix as well, would have just been incredible. But sadly that never happened. Now, when Karpov became world champion, there was a lot of talk that he would not have been world champion if Fischer was still around. However, Kasparov, in his book My Great Predecessors, discusses this and says that Karpov was working on chess for 12 hours a day during that period of the sort of like mid-1970s, early 1970s. He was working incredibly hard on chess. Later on, he became much lazier. But he was working incredibly hard on chess. And he's a phenomenal positional player, phenomenal prophylactic player. Karpov would always work very hard on destroying his opponent's plans. He loved chess as well. He'd analyse chess for many hours after the game. He would actually try to beat people in the analysis as well, which would demoralise them for future conflicts. But Karpov and Kasparov are outstanding Soviet players. So that's a fairly straightforward number 1 or 2. Now it gets a little bit more tricky. Number 3. Who is going to be my number 3? I'm actually going to go with Mikhail Botvinnik. Because Mikhail Botvinnik, in terms of pure strength, you wouldn't say Botvinnik, because obviously he went right back to 1930s. Even earlier, actually. He was playing chess back in 1920s. And he took part in the first Soviet championships, I believe. Or one of the first Soviet championships. Because this is discussed in this book's Memory, Dreams and Recollections, which is also published by El Karoubi Publishing. And Botvinnik, in my opinion, the reason I put him as number 3 is because he had several contributions to chess. Firstly, his whole philosophy about preparation was very impressive. Also, the fact that he was the first of his kind to win to win the World Championship from the Soviet Union. And I think that's most impressive. You know, if you're the first one, you're the pioneer. He also won back the World Championship after he lost it to Smyslov. So he spent a lot of time thinking about how to beat these people. Smyslov and Tao, he lost the World Championship to those people. Now, he did have this kind of slightly dodgy rule. And he was quite cold to some of his opponents. And I think that's why Botvinnik often gets overlooked. Because he kind of had this reputation of being a bit snotty towards some of his colleagues, and his playing style wasn't as interesting as, say, a Mikhail Tal. He often gets overlooked. But for me, Mikhail Botvinnik also had that kind of association with Kasparov, because there was a Botvinnik school of chess. For me, Botvinnik comes in as number 3 in the Soviet chess best ever. Bronstein kind of poured scorn in his Sazonko book. He talks about how, Botvinnik was a bit pretentious the way he played. It's sort of like all this kind of positional chess, rook D to C1 players, he would call them. Positional players, they do nothing and wait for the opponent to make a mistake. But in terms of actual impact on chess, I would put Mikhail Botvinnik as number 3 in terms of achievement as well. Number 4, I would probably give to Mikhail Tal, because Mikhail Tal is one of the most famous chess players of all time. Not only that, but he had amazing achievements. He's a very dynamic player. Obviously inspired a lot of these players who came later, particularly from Latvia, like people like Alexei Shirov, Alex Shabalov, and of course Garry Kasparov as well would have been inspired by Mikhail Tal. Players who came even later, like Veselin Topalov. So Mikhail Tal was just a wonderful player. He was a very nice human being. Everybody met him, seemed to have a good word to say about him. A colleague of Bobby Fischer's, a good friend of Bobby Fischer's as well. So Mikhail Tal comes in as number 4. However, you could mark him down a little bit, because obviously he only won the World Championship once, didn't retain it. But I think that was more due to some of his lifestyle choices. I think if he'd have had better lifestyle choices. I think he was only the 3rd Soviet player at that time to get over 2700 of that era. So Bobby Fischer got over 2700 first. He got 2785. Anatoly Karpov was then number 2. Then it was Mikhail Tal in 1980. And then later on, Garry Kasparov achieved it in something like 1983 or 1984. Okay, so who is our number 5 player? I'm going to go with... This is a tricky one, actually. It's getting tougher now. Let me think. Who should I go? You can tell I'm just doing this off the top of my head, right? as like all my videos, right? Okay, number 5. I'm actually going to go with Boris Spassky because I think Boris Spassky was an underrated world champion. And the reason I say that is because I played against Boris Spassky. And some of the variations he was showing me after game, I was just astounded by it. And we're going back 20 years. So Boris Spassky would have been in his 60s at that period. He also took part in the most famous world championship match of all time, which was the match against Bobby Fischer, which is arguably the most famous world championship match of all time in 1972. And he acquitted himself quite well. And Bobby Fischer said about that match that Boris Spassky was the only one who didn't break. He said that Petrosian broke eventually. He said Larson, there was a moment where they broke. Larson, Taimanov in the matches. Boris was the only one who didn't break. So Boris Spassky is actually my number 5. I'm sure that not everybody would agree with that. So number 6 in Soviet players. This is where it gets quite tricky. I'm going for Viktor Korchnoi. Is this number 6? So hang on, let me get the numbers right. So Botvinnik's number 3, Militao number 4, Spassky number 5, yeah, Korchnoi number 6. Now you could arguably, and this is what BoggHogster was trying to argue, that maybe he'd come in number 3 behind Karpov and Kasparov. Yusupov actually put him number 1 of 20th century players just because of his longevity. This is something I disagree with. And let me explain why. Now, Korchnoi in a way was like the first seniors player because you have all this seniors chess now that people love, right? So it gets people to keep going with their career when they don't really want to play all these opens, when they're playing against these underrated juniors. However, Korchnoi, although he was probably the first great senior player, also Smyslov as well, who we're going to mention later. Smyslov got to the candidates when he was in 1960, when he was in his 60s, in I think it's something like 983 or 984. However, Korchnoi's achievements, were great. But I think he actually improved after he left the Soviet Union. So he actually got better when he was in his late 40s. That's very unusual for a chess player. I'm in my late 40s now, so that something like that is inspiring. Late 40s, early 50s, Korchnoi was at his peak. Earlier in his career, he was kind of overshadowed by the fact there were so many good Soviet players, and he also had to take part in a lot of these competitions where they said, look, that guy's going to qualify now, so you have to throw that game, which he didn't like. But once he left, that was it. It's sort of like the shackles were loose then, and he could just focus on himself, didn't have to worry about anyone else. That's a good example where sometimes it's better to be a big fish in a small pool than a little fish in a big pool. Viktor Korchnoi is a very good example of that. However, I don't think necessarily you would rate him above just because he had these great achievements later in his career. I'm really looking at overall he was the strongest, he was the greatest when they were at their peak, rather than, they had a lot of great achievements later on when they were 65 or something. Don't get me wrong, I think Korchnoi was a great player, a very inspiring player, but I think this whole idea that somehow you're a better player than somebody because you were still getting good results when you were 65, even though you were more or less the same when you were 35, that doesn't really wash with me. That's what I don't agree with, is all this senior stuff. I don't think you're necessarily a better player because you keep going with your career. That's the argument I would make. So anyway, Viktor Korchnoi comes in as number 6. So who are we going to go for number 7? This is where it gets really tricky. Let's think about it. Who could come in as number 7, best ever Soviet players? Probably someone like Shirov took part in the Soviet Championship, right? Ivanchuk. But I think really those players, they didn't really spend enough time, playing under the Soviet flag or whatever. So I wouldn't go with those players personally. So I think number 7 would be Tigran Petrosian, who I think we discussed him before. He's quite a defensive player, Petrosian, but he was very, very hard to beat. He was a great defensive player, and we can learn so much from that because there's so many good attacking players out there. This is what I'm going to do for the next month or so, just study Petrosian games, because my problem is I keep collapsing. Petrosian was anything but a collapser. He was very, very hard to beat. He was very tough. So people don't focus enough on the defensive part of the game. In my opinion, Tigran Petrosian is my number 7 best Soviet player of all time. And also, he was the only Soviet player other than Mikhail Botvinnik from that 1940s, 1950s, 1960s era to win more than one World Championship match. I mentioned this before, that Smyslov only ever beat Botvinnik. I think he only won one World Championship match. Spassky only won one World Championship match against Petrosian, and Tao only won one World Championship match. But Petrosian won 2 World Championship matches. That's why I put Botvinnik so high, because he won so many World Championship matches. He beat, he won the candidates in 1948, I believe that was in The Hague. And then he defended his title against Bronstein in 1951. Then he lost to Smyslov. But then he won it again against Smyslov. Maybe he'd beaten Smyslov before that, I don't know. It's all a bit, the 1950s is a bit confusing to me, right? I should look at the 1950s period of World Championship matches. But then he lost to Tao, but then he won it against Tao. But then he lost to Petrosian, so that was the end. But, you know, just to keep bouncing back was remarkable. I know you had that kind of dodgy rule in there, but even so, you still have to win those matches, right? And somehow he managed to win those matches. So Botvinnik, that's why I put Botvinnik so high. But Petrosian as well. So it comes in, so what do we got? Let me work this out. You can tell I haven't written this down, right? Garry Kasparov number 1, that's obvious. Karpov number 2. We had Botvinnik number 3. And then we had Mikhail Tal number 4, Boris Spassky number 5, Korchnoi number 6, Petrosian number 7. So I've got 8, 9 and 10 to go. Right, who am I going to pick? I think 8 should be Vasily Smyslov. Vasily Smyslov should be number 8. Because Vasily Smyslov was a great, great player. I think he was actually, you know, underestimated world champion as well, because actually to get into the candidates when you're in your 60s, can you imagine somebody now in their 60s getting to the candidate, you know, getting to the candidates, even just getting to the candidates? There's more than one. So when he played in the candidates, he played against Garry Kasparov in a match. So I think he beat Hubner on the spin of a roulette wheel, because they're basically tied. And I'm not sure what he did after that. I'm sure I read somewhere they beat Hubner, Robert Hubner, who famously annotated this game. He spent a whole book annotating one game. But Smyslov was, you know, a great player. Had loads of beautiful games, actually. He was kind of like an artist. Another example where when you're playing chess, you're using a higher part of your brain, because he's also a very good musician. So Smyslov comes in as number 8, of greatest Soviet players ever. So 9 and 10. I'm going to go number 9, David Bronstein. He was the only person from that era I was lucky. I've also met Garry Kasparov, but that didn't go down very well. Didn't really talk to me. But I met David Bronstein, who did talk to me. He's a nicer guy than Garry Kasparov, to be honest. Nicer guy. Maybe not quite as strong as chess, but also very strong. And he very nearly beat Mikhail Botvinnik in a World Championship match. Now, when I did this book review, I mentioned the fact that David Bronstein would, you know, Jenna Zizonko was mentioning how David Bronstein was complaining a lot about the fact that obviously he lost to Mikhail Botvinnik. He felt that he should have won that match. And there was a sort of slight bitterness that he carried throughout the rest of his life. It's almost like you're Jimmy White, right? Jimmy White lost several World Championship titles. But I don't mean he's bitter about it. But maybe Bronstein's a little bit bitter about it, because it basically would have changed his life. If he'd have been world champion, look how famous Tao is. There's a lot of casual players around the world now who've heard of Mikhail Tao. But none of them would have heard of David Bronstein. Very few would have heard of David Bronstein, because he never won a World Championship match. Sorry, the microphone just fell over there. But, so I would go with David Bronstein. He was also a very imaginative player. He also gave a lot to chess in terms of opening theory. He pioneered the King's Indian to some extent. So David Bronstein was a really imaginative, creative player. Didn't like computers that much. Didn't like chess computers. Felt they were destroying chess. He also created... So when you hear about Fischer Random, Fischer really stole that idea from Bronstein. And the Fischer clock, that was another Bronstein idea. He had all these ideas bubbling in his mind. If he was around now, he'd get diagnosed with ADHD. So that's David Bronstein's number 9. But who's number 10? This is where it gets really tricky. I'm actually going to go with a slightly unusual name. or a name that some of you may not have heard of, some of you would have heard of him. I'm actually going to go with Poligayevsky. And the reason I'm going to go with Poligayevsky, so there's quite a few candidates. Let's mention some. I'm just going to do this off the top of my head, right? So there's Nazitanov, Rashid Zaditanov. There's all the guys from the early era as well. You know, Alekhine's brother. Probably not one of the better known players. There's Swaitin. There's Geller. Geller is probably should be mentioned as well, of course. Efim Geller. He was a great theoretician. There's a great story about him actually. The Garry Kasparov rang up Geller for the World Championship match in 1993 against Nigel Short. And he asked, you know, what should I do against Nigel Short's Marshall? Because he's going to be very well prepped in a Marshall. And Geller said, play this anti-Marshall system where you go A4, D3, you know, very solid, right? So basically, that was very interesting. I mean, I heard as well that Kasparov actually went to the Chess and Bridge Centre in Houston at that time to buy a openings book, and like an old openings book on the poison pawn variation of the 6 Bishop G5 Knight off. So that was part of his preparation. However, I won't go with Geller. Let's mention some other names. Salov is another name that I think he went a little bit Fruit Loopy, right? Salov, Valery Salov. He did play under the USSR banner for a number of years. So he would certainly count as a Soviet player. He got to as high as number 3. He was a great player, but he complained. He was like the sort of Hans Niemann of his era because he kind of complained a lot about the chess mafia and how Karpov and Kasparov were controlling all the invites. Alexander Belyevsky was a contemporary of Garry Kasparov, also a very good player, should be mentioned as well. Arthur Yusupov could be up there. I'm probably forgetting some other names as well, right? As I said, Vasily Ivanchuk, if you purely say Soviet Union players, you don't count the fact that he only played in the Soviet Union for a short number of years, you'd certainly say Ivanchuk would make the top 10. Mikhail Gurevich is another name. He was a trainer of Karpov and Kasparov, and later Anand as well. Mikhail Gurevich, very strong player. I think he got to 2,700 briefly. Krasenko, Sutovsky, I think they're all Soviet Union players. I'm actually going to go with Poligayevsky. The reason I'm going to go with Poligayevsky is he was quite a formidable player during the 1960s, 1970s. He was up there. He played a candidates match against Karpov. But the main reason I'm going to go with Poligayevsky was I think he died in 1990s, maybe 2000s. He died fairly young, right? But he pioneered this Poligayevsky variation. I was fascinated reading about how he spent months and months really refining this variation before unleashing it. And that inspires us now because all we do now is analyze with engines. It's so boring, right? We need people like Poligayevsky who are good at opening theory. He was good at opening theory. You know, that's what Soviet Union chess was all about. You had all these cold winters, right? So what you would do is you would study chess, and that's what Poligayevsky did. He studied that variation. So I'm going to go number 10, Poligayevsky. Mark Taimanov would also be Taimanov because he, you know, which to be fair, I mean the Taimanov variation is considered to be a lot more sound than the Poligayevsky variation probably, but the Taimanov variation is Sicilian. That happens quite early. Taimanov was also a fabulous player. Piano player as well, you know, another example where using high part of your brain, a little bit like Smyslov, who was a great musician. So Mike Taimanov as well would also, right, but that's my top 10. So let's go through them in order. So you've got Garry Kasparov number 1, Anatoly Karpov number 2. You then got Mikhail Botvinnik number 3. Number 4 we gave to, who did we give? We gave Mikhail Tal number 4. He said number 5, Boris Spassky. Erudite, urbane, sophisticated, funny guy, Boris Spassky, also great chess player. Number 6, Viktor Korchnoi. A lot of people disagree with that. If you want to put Viktor Korchnoi as your number 3, I wouldn't disagree. You know, I think actually the number 5 to number 3 to number 8 is very tricky. You could put them in any order, right? So we had number 6 was Viktor Korchnoi. Number 7 was Tigran Petrosian. Number 8 was Vasily Smyslov. Number 9 was David Bronstein, and number 10 was Lev Poligayevsky. So that's my top 10 Soviet Union chess players ever. Please leave your comments down below. Do you agree with me? I'm sure you've got some other names I haven't mentioned. As I said, there were a lot of players later on, probably in 1960s as well, 1970s, I haven't even mentioned that, you know, as soon as you tell me, I'll be like, how the hell did I leave that person out, right? But pretty much everybody's heard of Kasparov and Karpov. That was pretty much a gimme. And they also played under the Soviet Union banner for many, many years. So therefore they qualify. Unlike Ivanchuk, who only really played for 2 or 3 years before the breakup of the Soviet Union. So anyway, that's my list. Please like and subscribe.